Hi, Cara.
Hi, Vanessa.
So every once in a while, a book comes across our desk that changes our lives. And Doug Bolton's book, Untethered, sent to us by our shared agent, the wonderful Heather Jackson, is one of those books.
We're going to keep the intro short and just get to the episode. But here's a little bit of Doug's cred so that you can actually understand where he comes from and why his advice is so salient. So Doug is a PhD clinical psychologist, and he's an educational leader. He has been in education since 1987 and focused on students with social, emotional, and behavioral challenges. And he's worked in a number of therapeutic schools, both as the school psychologist and as principal, namely North Shore Academy, which is a K-12 public therapeutic school on the North Shore of Chicago. And in addition to his work in schools, he is also a therapist who works in private practice. He now consults. He's no longer the head of school. He now consults with schools and school leaders. He is so thoughtful and comes by this advice, which is built on decades of experience, in a way that really will benefit everyone who is listening to this episode.
And I'll just say, it literally changed how I parented my kid in the midst of reading this book in the most wonderful of ways. It changed what I did. So it's a long episode. Feel free to pause, come back to it, but listen to the entire episode. I promise it is worth it.
Hi, Doug.
It's so good to be here. Hi, Cara.
Hi. Okay. I'm starting with a story that you know, but our listeners don't know. But I think it will contextualize how obsessed Vanessa and I are with this book, and also a little bit of the why. This whole episode is going to get people to the why, because I am confident that as soon as you start to open your mouth, they're going to become equally they're going to be fanimals. Okay, so here...
Did you just make that turn?
I sure did. I made that up. So here's the story. My agent, your agent, reached out and said, I'd love you to read this book and say whether or not you'd like to blurb it. And this was embarrassingly long ago. I mean, maybe it might have been early fall, late summer. It was a long time ago. We are recording in February of 2025. And I said, of course, because she doesn't do it often enough that I worry about the quality of what she's sending. She only sends good stuff. So it sat, and life passed me by. And there were a million things going on, and I was empty nesting, and Vanessa and I were traveling across the country speaking. And for whatever reason, it got missed. And she would send me these little emails every once in a while, hey, which is her way of saying, have you read the book? And I would say, hey, which was my way of saying, I'm getting to it. I swear I'm getting to it. And then she sent me this email and she was like, just so you know, the window has closed and you cannot blurb the book. And she's never done this before. So I picked up the book and I read it. And I could not stop reading it. I got on the phone with Vanessa. I was like, Vanessa, this is truly, I think the best book. We've read all the books in this genre. You go to this shelf in a bookstore, which might be called parenting or might be called something else. And I mean, we've read every single, and I was like, Vanessa, this is a game changer of a book. And I wrote
and no shade to the other books that we've covered and loved. But Doug, this is
like next level. And I wrote an email to our agent and I was like, I know I missed the window, but I'm literally down on my knees begging you. Here is my blurb. Please, 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 please. And even if you won't put it on the book, which is fine with me, please just send it to Doug. And I didn't know what had happened until we scheduled this podcast and I found out I made it onto your book cover, which I'm very excited. I think I'm on the back cover and I'm very excited because it really is like, I haven't felt this strongly about people knowing how much I loved a book in, I don't remember how long, years probably.
Not even about our book was she this
No,
enthusiastic.
Doug, you beat our book.
Okay, so with that preamble, Doug, I mean, our listeners are all sitting here like, okay, great, Cara, we got it. Can we get to the meat
Get
here?
to the why. You always say to explain why.
Doug, tell us, people have heard your bio, but essentially your work for decades has focused on the kids. And I'm going to use a phrase and you may correct me or edit it a little bit, but your work has focused on the kids who are kind of at the final stop. Like you were sort of the last stop on their educational journey. And if it didn't work out with you and your community of educators, then that was kind of it, right? They were the kids with behavioral issues, addiction issues, violence issues. Tell us what it's like to be that person, to be that school, to be that community, to be that psychologist.
Oh, it's a great question. And thank you both for having me on. I'm just so thrilled. And I just want to say that the blurb you wrote, I loved it because you described the book I'd hoped to write, if that makes sense. And so I'm really grateful for all of this. So thank you. I think it's a challenge as I think about how do we conceptualize how to support the kids who are on the fringes of our communities. And when I went to North Shore Academy, one of the things that was very clear and something that was new to me was that these were the students who couldn't make it in their home schools. And the real mission was to keep them in their communities. And so instead of what was in the last 20 years been zero tolerance policies in school, we had the opposite. It was a zero reject. We took every student that would come to us, and it was our job to stay with them and not to have them go to residential treatment outside of the broader community. Oftentimes those facilities are out of state. And it's not that it never happened, but when you don't have the option of quitting, it's amazing how resilient you can be. And then it's amazing how transformational the work can become. That was the piece that was most striking to me, was when you're able to hang with kids and families long enough and provide that support and community, it's amazing what can happen and what outcomes can happen. And I spent every day inspired by the strength of these students who walk through the hallways every day. And I think that the key piece then is not, if you're an expert in cognitive behavioral therapy, it's not about any of that. It's about, can you create communities for kids where they can be resilient? And in order to do that, you need to create communities for adults.
And Doug, you talk about, so we're going to go broad first, and then we're going to really drill down into a bunch of terms and concepts that will help people appreciate how powerful your work is and your book is. But you talk about the importance of community to these kids, to all kids, as communities are disappearing and dissipating. So it's this incredible tension between something that is so important and yet has become so elusive for many people. Why is community so important for kids' well-being?
It's deeply embedded in our evolution, this idea that we are community beings. And, Jamil Zaki said, I can't remember exactly the quote, but, we are not physically much to behold in the animal kingdom. And yet, so the only way that we
Speak for yourself, Doug.
So the only way that we could survive is as a community. I could sit there with fire and a spear, and I would not be able to fend off the woolly mammoth or any of the other dangers. So we needed to come together in community. And as a community, we could do remarkable things. And so being disconnected triggers something very, very primitive in our biology that then triggers things emotionally that pulls us together. I think as society has shifted in so many ways, we've focused less and less on the power of community and begun, interestingly, I think, to engage more and more and seek. We've created more and more experiences of scarcity, which pushes us to be competitive for these scarce positions, whether it be for our kids on travel teams, whether it be for slots in an AP class, whether it be for highly selective colleges. And as a result, we find ourselves more in competition with one another, even our good friends, than we do in collaboration.
So, I mean, I want to drill down on that a little bit, because as Vanessa said at the top, your own professional experience is with kids who live on the fringe, who are at their sort of last stop on the educational journey before the journey ends and they get tossed out and essentially uneducated. And you write about them and you write about your experiences and you tell stories, but it's really about all kids. I mean, there's nothing about what you describe that is anything less than universal. And I think the thing that makes that so is the loneliness epidemic, right? Is exactly what you're describing, is this sort of push away from community in the world where we're living, that, everyone has to fight hard to hold on to. And that's not always the primary value in a school, whether it's a school for kids who have struggled or whether, frankly, it's a high achieving school where kids are thriving and they're loving their educational journey. Still, community is not prized in the same way. So can we drill down a little bit? What I have two questions, actually. One is kind of what can the trusted adults, parents and trusted adults in kids' lives do in order to help be in community with the school environments that the kids are in? And then second, and we can take the conversation in this general direction, how do behaviors become a symptom of disconnection and of lack of community?
Yeah, great questions. In schools, I do a lot of this work now. I think that the mental health epidemic, there's a lot of reasons why there's a mental health epidemic. It's interesting if you track emergency room visits by week, emergency room visits for mental health, pediatric mental health emergency room visits plummet when school's not in session, and they skyrocket when school is in session. And even if you take a look at the week of Thanksgiving, which only has 3 days off, you still see that trend of those visits plummeting. And so schools have a role in this, right? And I think that there's been, and as we talk about scarcity and we talk about competition, schools are in competition with one another for test scores. Countries are in competition for one another. Mental health and a sense of belonging in kids worldwide has plummeted in the last 10 or 15 years. And really, you start seeing it happen in around 2006, which is, in my research, really corresponds to when we began to take test scores much more seriously. And all of a sudden, I think we went as schools to focusing on how do we help kids develop, so how do we help our test scores develop? And in doing so, and everybody in the community is drinking from the same water, whether it be students, parents, educators, the mayor, the real estate agents want our test scores to go up because then housing prices go up. All of these things are signs of status. And it's not to say the data is wrong, that there's something wrong about collecting data. That's not it. But the piece that we forget, and I think is an important piece, is that we need to have connection in order to drive the data. What we know is that communities of belonging are what push the numbers. You need to feel a sense of belonging. You need to be emotionally regulated for your brains to open up so you can learn. And I think we've lost that.
Let's dive in there, because there's so many parts of your work that sort of upend what we imagine. You sort of are flipping paradigm after paradigm in terms of like the order of operations. And I just want to point out for our listeners that not only have you dealt with this journey that we're about to talk through as a psychologist and as an educator in schools, but you've dealt with it with your own child, and you've dealt with aspects of this in your own story and your own history. And so the layer upon layer that you urge us to look at with the kids in our lives, you actually unpeel all of those layers yourself in the process of the book unfolding. And as everyone listens to this episode, I want them to keep in mind the unpeeling of their own onion as well, because we can't do this work. We can't be in this conversation. We can't guide and support kids without being aware of everything we bring to it in ourselves.
Yeah.
And it starts, Doug, with attachment.
Yeah.
And attachment theory is a term that, like, I think they're like handing it out with like the Happy Meal at McDonald's. I mean, it's like everybody and their mother is talking about it. Half of the people talking about it are defining it incorrectly or partially or inaccurately. So let's ground the conversation in attachment theory and your definition of it, and why it is such an important concept to this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. So as I think about attachment, I think about our ability to make meaningful connections with one another. The challenge is that as we take a look and dive deeply into the research on attachment, it begins in utero. There's so many different ways that we connect, or that we get messages that being connected is not safe. I think Bruce Perry talks about this beautifully in his work, is that these forms templates, our earliest relationships form templates for whether or not relationships were safe in the world, or whether or not we need to be on guard, defended against relationships because they can cause us distress. There's a conscious part of this, but so much of this is driven unconsciously through the the parts of our more instinctive selves. And so what happens is, if we have early relationships that are full of conflict, full of fear, that those templates require more and more repetitions of connection, more and more repetitions of emotional regulation, regulated interactions, in order for us to be able to override those early connections. At North Shore Academy, where I was the principal and a school psychologist for years, that was really our work, was to try and give kids who had, many of whom who had early attachment challenges, to help them rewrite those attachment systems so that all of a sudden their nervous system could feel safer in relationship to other people.
Can you give an example of a kid? I mean, there's several in the book, but I want to help people visualize someone as we begin to unpack these concepts.
There's one that I think of, and I don't even think he's in the book, but
I'll allow it.
Yeah. He was a young man. He came to us as a seventh grader, and you could tell that he had attachment issues from his file, just by seeing who he was living with. He was living with his grandmother and his great-grandmother. And so there's a story there about how is he not living with, he's not living with either parent. And it turned out that one parent had significant mental illness and the other had been incarcerated. And he came to us, and he was about as disruptive and aggressive and defiant as we've had in a seventh grader. And he very much struggled. And we hung on and he slowly, by the time he was in ninth grade, began to stay connected. And in a lot of ways, I feel like with kids with attachment issues, it often means that they're going to push others away.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard for them to trust, and as a result, and the stronger the trust issues, the harder they're going to push away from those who are trying to reconnect, because it's a threat to them, and it takes these repetitions. And so, by the time he was in ninth grade, he started to connect a little bit more. Was still wildly disruptive, but then he had a substance use issue, and he left us to address that, his substance use. And he came back, and slowly, and this takes years, slowly he was able to reconnect and quiet that nervous system. And so by the time he was a junior, he started taking classes back at his home school. And I'll never forget, one of the things that he said was, I'm so glad I'm transitioning back to my home school, but when I walk into that school, I feel like I'm a number. And when I walk into North Shore Academy, he says, I feel like I'm walking into a hug. Isn't that a great line?
Beautiful.
And so he ended up going to Northern Illinois University, where he majored in business administration. And he came back and he spoke at an assembly for everyone. And he was able to say, I don't know how you kept me here. And he finished his talk by saying how important this community was to him. And he bounded off the stage, and he fell right into the arms of his 7th grade teacher, who had felt like she had failed him, because it felt like by the time she had left, he didn't seem to have made any progress. She felt like she had no connection to him. And so then the story continues, because he reached out to me a few years ago and wanted to get a letter of recommendation for graduate school. And so he's gotten his MBA from DePaul. And
I mean,
so,
come on.
So
That's
these
amazing.
are, but the key thing is we need to be resilient as adults to be able to stick with kids in this way, and to make sure that as much as he pushes us away, we can stay connected.
So your example of what attachment theory really means is beautiful, right? You need, and you write about this a lot, but that last story, you just need one.
Yeah.
You need one secure attachment. Doug, will you talk to us a little bit about what happens to kids in general when they don't have that one? What are some of the downstream consequences?
One is good, many is better, right? And I think about attachment as our connection to one person, and belonging is our connection to a community. And I talk about one of our students in the very first page of the book. He was a 7th grader and was struggling with drug use and oppositional behavior, refusing to do any work. He had a Gandhi-esque approach to his defiance. He wasn't necessarily in your face with it, but he's like, you can't hurt me any more than I've already hurt myself. So everybody's efforts to punish him for this, he would just kind of say, bring it on. You want to give me 1 day of in-school suspension? I'll take 3. And he was adopted, and his parents divorced. And as his story began to unfold, what I realized was he never felt accepted by his stepfather, and his mother really struggled to know how to navigate that, and she had her own mental health issues. And so he was with us for about a year and a half, and then he went to live with his dad. So he had to leave our school because he was in a different school district, went to a different home, a different school, ended up having to leave that school, went to another school. And you just get this picture of a young man who lives with that disconnection and the drug use and the challenges with delinquency. He was stealing. And by the time he was 17, he had a drug overdose. And I'll never forget the call from his dad. It there's a voicemail. He said, "Douglas, our journey is over." And that was very meaningful to me. What it helped me realize is that there are that a lack of belonging can be lethal. And
yeah, I mean, I want to talk about for a second about family structure.
Yeah.
And both having a secure attachment within a family and belonging in a family, because we get questions all the time about how different family structures impact kids. That story was the hook for me, partly because I come from a family structure where I have 2 adopted brothers and my parents divorced. And that first anecdote that you use, it painted such a broad stroke. So many of my brother's friends who also were adopted, so many of my mom's friends who adopted kids have talked about attachment in the face of building a family in a slightly different way. And so I wonder if you can give a little bit of advice or insight to families who are looking for pearls. It's whether your family is built through remarriage, through adoption, through surrogacy, these can all feel like hurdles to attachment, and they are.
Yeah.
What is the best advice that you can give these families for navigating those hurdles so that they can connect in a meaningful way? Because my understanding of attachment is ultimately it's showing up.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like at like the most base level.
Yeah.
If you show up, then the recipient on the other end will feel secure. They will feel like you show up. So I don't know if you have any advice for people who are afraid their kids are at the front end of that road that you just described. How do you redirect them?
Yeah, well, I love that. I think it's Joan Alero who said, insecure attachment is not a life sentence. It's a constant remodeling of our attachment system. We're constantly going through it. I think one of the things that's hardest about when kids do experience attachment issues is that our way of dealing with that is to push others away, as opposed to bringing people close, because it's the attachment itself that causes this very primitive level of anxiety for them. I like and I think, again, this is Bruce Perry's language, I think, is what we need to do is we need to provide doses of connection and support. And so when you say showing up, what I think of is it's not just showing up and having everything be okay. It's being able to stay and be present, even when you're getting pushed away. It's this steadfastness, and it's not pushing. I guess what the other thing that we can do is we can try and overwhelm them with our love and attachment, and oftentimes that'll push them away farther. So I like the idea of showing up. And I think I used this line in my book. My daughter actually shared this line with me. She said, "Don't just do something, stand there." Right?
Yes. Doug, that's what's so important, because you get into the nervous system of it all.
Yeah.
Which I want to talk about. But I think this is a good moment for you to share, because people may be listening and they may be thinking, oh, well, he's so smart, and I'm sure he's the perfect parent because he has held fast to all these children who needed it, and he, all these transformational journeys and all of that. And yet, as Cara and I talk endlessly about, Doug, me even more than Cara, is our imperfections as parents. And you share that in the book. And so even knowing all of this, right? Even decades of experience as a psychologist and an educator, when it came to don't just do something, stand there, it was difficult for you, as it is incredibly difficult for the two of us.
Yeah.
What did you notice in your own family constellation, and listeners, please don't worry that I am delving into deeply personal topics with Doug that he doesn't want to talk about, because he writes in great detail about this. So don't worry, I'm not putting him on the spot. What did you learn as a parent, or what did you fail to learn as a parent that you knew as an educator, and help our listeners understand what you just sort of don't just do something, stand there?
I love this question. It's so funny. A number of people, after they've read an early copy of the book, said, "How does it feel like having all that out there? You talk a lot about, about my own struggles as a parent, my own struggles with attachment." And, I think that my parents' divorce, before the divorce, I felt like I was in we had what felt like a very stable home. And then at age 6, just as, attachment can improve over time, there can also be these moments that really can undermine our attachment. So I think I was pretty securely attached until 6. And then I very quickly, as my dad left and my mom, who hadn't been working before that, went from being a stay-at-home mom to working full-time and going to school to become a social worker. And all of a sudden, the 4 of us kids were in many ways left to fend for ourselves, which we all survived. We're doing fine, but it wasn't pretty.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that at different points in time, whether it be with my son Matthew, who struggled with executive functioning and then struggled in school in ways that made me feel powerless, that made me feel ineffective. We adopted my oldest daughter from. She was adopted. She originally was born in Rwanda and has her own attachment story, and I had my attachment story. And together, those attachment stories, I think we triggered one another's attachment, and I learned a lot from my failures. And I hope to write a book. As I was writing it, I didn't want to shy away from that, because I don't think any of this is easy. I don't think it can be helpful to have the information, but it's also, you can have the information, but really struggle to show up. And so I think that I guess I wanted to make that struggle real, and it's okay. It's part of the process, but we all are going to struggle, and not to feel like, oh, if you just do it right, everything is easy. If you just know this stuff, read this book and parenting will be easy. And it doesn't work that way, right?
I think I heard a little nod to your next book, which is very atypical, as you're going out on book tour, thoroughly exhausted by writing your first book. So I give you a lot of credit there. You're right, of course. There's also another layer for you, which is that people turn to you for expertise and advice at a really tricky time in their life. Like, it's not just like, you're a run-of-the-mill, not that any educator is run-of-the-mill, we worship educators, but, you're kind of at a run-of-the-mill school and everything's typical. You literally had the role of saving kids who were hanging out over the abyss.
Yeah.
And you're human, and it's not going perfectly in your own home. That feels very vulnerable, right?
Yeah,
I mean, imposter syndrome is just the most benign way of describing at least how I feel in that scenario, where people are asking me medical advice and my kids are, not thriving because I missed something big.
Sure.
It's a really, and how did you walk that tightrope?
I compartmentalized probably to a fault. The thing that I think that allowed me to be really present for the students that I worked with was the team that I worked with, and the ability to know that it wasn't just me, and the ability to be able to laugh with people, to be able to develop relationships with parents and staff, and And to know that, one of the things that we really learned early on, and this is kind of an underlying theme of everything I think we've been talking about, is our own dysregulation.
Right.
And when I'm dysregulated, I lose a lot when I'm emotionally dysregulated. And typically the things that emotionally dysregulate us, I call them the holy trinity of dysregulation, but it's feeling disconnected, feeling powerless, and feeling devalued. And when I was at North Shore Academy, we had teams of people. So when I was feeling that way, there were always going to be other people who I could pass this off to. And it didn't have the same level of, when a student is yelling at me, it feels really different than when my own child is yelling at me. And it dysregulates me in a very different way. And so I was able to I think I was able to be present with students in a way that I wasn't able to be present at home, because it cut deeper for me and triggered my attachment stuff more for me than it did at school.
I always say, I've coached thousands of girls in sports who are like just learning how to play sports, right? Which is like a very vulnerable moment. And I always say, like, I could go out there and coach thousands of them every day of my life and like never lose it. Give me 15 minutes with one of my own kids. And it's like
15.
Yeah, I know. 15 on a good day. And it's like somehow, not somehow, I'm sure there's all sorts of reasons, as you mentioned, why we are better with others who may be even more challenging than our own kids on paper, but feel much more challenging to us. So, Doug, we become dysregulated with our children. That is an understatement of the millennia. And I learned something new in the book. Cara and I spent a lot of time thinking about, writing about, talking to audiences about how to support kids through mood swings, how to support kids, how to help them make better decisions, and kind of what happens in their brains as they're under construction and as they're sort of this hormonal stew and this wonderful, beautiful mess. But you talk about the stress response in all people and what role the prefrontal cortex gets to play or not play when we feel under threat, and sort of what physiologically happens in the brain when our stress response kicks in, and why the prefrontal cortex essentially gets kicked out of the process. Can you talk about that? It totally blew me away.
Yeah, it was so helpful for me, and that was one of the exciting things about being at North Shore Academy, while also learning about these things. It was just like, oh, there it is, right? That we had developed these systems of, you have this behavior, and so we're going to punish you this way. And we were successful at it, but for all the wrong reasons, right? When we began to frame these behavioral concerns as regulation and not motivation, it really shifted things. And in order to understand regulation, you need to understand a little bit about the brain. And I think that there's the triune brain theory, which I find helpful. And it's way more complex than just 3 different layers of brain, but it's a great metaphor. And I think it's held up over several decades in terms of, I think, a metaphor for how the brain works. But there's the cortex, and the prefrontal cortex is really the executive center of how we make our best decisions. There's the limbic system, which is really our alarm system. We think about that as more of the midbrain. What it's really doing is saying, am I safe or not safe? Right? And if I'm not safe, then I'm going to trigger the nervous system, the brainstem, which then automatically creates this cascading of neurotransmitter hormonal activity that really triggers that fight, flight, or freeze response. The other thing that the limbic system does, that midbrain does, is it stores emotional memories. It stores things that really tell us, are we safe or not safe? And our brains are really built for survival. They're not built for rational thinking. And what happens is the cortex is very slow. It's very, very slow. And you don't want to put your hand on a hot stove and think, oh, I smell something burning. I wonder what it could be, right? And what you need is something to pull that hand right off. Or the number of times like I'm biking and I close my eyes before I feel something hit. It's like there's a lot going on way outside of our conscious awareness. And our limbic system is constantly monitoring our environment to see if we're safe or not. And that's where our early templates from early childhood show up later on, is in these embedded memories, embedded in our limbic system. What ends up happening is that that there's all sorts of our body is totally geared towards fighting and fleeing. And so what it does is it shuts down those parts of our those systems in our body that use up the most energy. And our brains are 2% of our body mass, but take up 20% of our energy. And it's like, like you could take a 3-hour test and be sitting there and come out exhausted. And it's like, oh, why? I've just been sitting there. It's because you've been using all of that energy. And the next system is our digestive system. That shuts down so that we can have energy, so that our energy moves to our skeletal muscles and we can fight and flee. And so all of a sudden we talk about, some ways we talk about it as full brain and lower brain. There's all sorts of ways that we talk about it, but we're just not we don't have access to our best thinking when we feel some level of threat. And so the goal then, and typically, unfortunately, our efforts then are to get kids to listen to it. Then all of a sudden we try and access parts of the brain the child just can't access, right?
And probably we also can't access.
We can't access it because it's really hard. It's when you're with someone who's dysregulated, it's really hard to stay regulated yourself. I think there's been research on this, but I remember hearing Ross Greene mention this one time. He's done some beautiful writing on on clever problem solving with kids. But he said, when we are melting down, it's like we've lost 30 IQ points. And it's like, I think I'd say 40 for me, right? Like I just make really bad decisions in those moments. And it's not that I want to, it's just that I can't access those parts of my brain that aren't that helpful when we're running from a grizzly bear. It's not that helpful to be able to listen, right? It's not.
What's so crazy is, I don't know about you, but I am acutely aware that I am making that bad decision while I am making it.
Yes.
Right? It's like my prefrontal cortex is doing something. It's telling me that. And I often think about, do kids have the gift of not being aware that it's a bad decision while they're doing it?
I hope so.
Right.
It is funny that, that some of the things that it's harder to inhibit our impulses, right? That's what you're talking about. We're not as flexible. Think about the last time you lost your temper. Like I become remarkably inflexible. I think I'm a pretty flexible guy, but you dysregulate me and I become inflexible. I lose empathy.
Mm-hmm.
We lose language. The only words I can think of are 4 letters long, right? And I feel like I've got to yell them because somehow that makes it clearer, right? And so all of a sudden, I just can't access these skills of having empathy because it's not when we're fighting a physical threat, which is the way our brains were meant. This is how our brains were meant to react. It's not helpful to have empathy for the grizzly. I hope the grizzly bear doesn't hurt itself while it's chasing me. No, that's it. Like, we don't, right? We don't want to be flexible because we got to choose one tack and go for it, right? And
so, Doug, let's take a reframe on this whole thing. That's so funny. I have a fear of caterpillars. I don't know why. That's like what I picture that I'm being chased by, which hopefully I could outrun a caterpillar.
I think you can outrun. I'm just saying.
No, I think I'm good. But like for some reason, that's my fear animal. Okay. So what I took from the book, so many things, but one of the things I took from, and you're actually quoting somebody else, but it's in the context of this conversation, right? Everyone's dysregulated. We're going straight to the 4-letter words and the shouting and the punishments, right? And we're locking stuff down and we're losing it and we're disconnection is rampant, right? And then there's this sentence, which is, kids do well when they can.
Yeah.
And I will tell you that reading your book couldn't have come at a better time, because I had a situation with my own kid, and my initial reaction was to go to that dysregulated place. And I actually had the benefit of not being with him in person when, it's a homework situation. It was not like the world was coming to an end, but my stress response initially was as if the world was coming to an end, right? But I wasn't there with him, and I had a minute, and I had literally just finished reading your book. And I'm like, kids do well when they can. Kids do well when they can. Kids do well when they can. What is it that's getting in the way of him doing well in this scenario? And it was, as you say, at another point in the book, not what can I take away? What can I give this kid to set them up for success? So in our regulated moments, we can have this thought, we can use this mantra, we can think about these things. Why is it that this works? Why is it true that kids do well when they can? That's what Cara and I like to believe, right? Why is it that what can I give this kid, not what can I take away? Why does that work? Why does that matter when we're supporting kids?
I love the question. So the person I'm quoting is, again, it's Ross Greene, and he worked with Stuart Ablon to develop the collaborative problem-solving method. They each have their own work on that, and it's compelling. I love the next line: "Kids do well if they can," and then I can't remember the last line. Kids do well if they can. I'll come up with it later. But
oh my God, I feel so much better about my brain.
We spent a half
hour.
I got it. See, I knew it was going to come.
That's so wrong. Okay, go.
Doing well is always preferable to not doing well.
Yes.
Isn't that good? Right?
Yes.
And so then can we get curious about this? The challenge about being dysregulated, and as a parent, there are two things that show up for us. One is there's a sense of urgency. Right? I've got to deal with this right now, right? And there's an exaggeration, or else if he doesn't do his homework now, he'll never do his homework. How is he ever, I don't know how old your child is. 14. He'll never be able to make it in college, right? How will he ever hold on a job if he can't, this is...
the benefit for this fourth child is that all of those worries have been answered by his siblings screwing up and me realizing it'll be just fine. And yet still. In
this moment, that's how our brains work. So this is like right at the core of so much of what we can do when kids are struggling. And we've created a system where we think it's about motivation. And if we think it's about motivation, then we're going to punish and incentivize. Stuart Shanker really helped me understand this work in his book, Self-Reg. He really says misbehavior is stress behavior. And when I think about myself, like there are times when I can handle stress really well. And it's like, oh no, I got this. And other times I completely fall apart as a parent or whatever. And it's not about the situation. Part of it may be about the situation I'm in and how stressful that is. But a lot of it is the stress that I'm bringing to this. And so the question then becomes, what is the stress? Why is it that this afternoon, my son's struggling with homework and yesterday afternoon they didn't? What's different about that? And I wonder, or every afternoon they melt down when I ask them to do homework or when I ask them to do X, Y, and Z. Misbehavior is stress behavior. And so how can we understand what the stress is? And then if we can address the stress, then the behavior goes away. When we focus on the behavior, oftentimes we make the behavior even more challenging.
And this is particularly complicated because parents in particular tend to fall into one of two camps. Not all, but many. One camp is the sort of lens of I. What did I do to stress out my kid? Which creates a lot of anxiety for a lot of parents. And the other is the camp of you. What did the world do? What did this other kid do? What did the school do? And there's got to be a better path, because neither of those paths really is super effective as a first pass of getting curious.
Yeah, no, I love that frame. And I think we do want to find someone to blame or something to blame. And I either blame myself. And I think that one of the things that we can really get in the way of our kids is to say that when they're distressed, when they're dysregulated, something's wrong. But the truth is, we all get dysregulated all the time. And the question is not, how do we help them avoid getting dysregulated? And that's where the whole idea of a snowplow parent comes in, right? Or a helicopter parent to come in and rescue them so that just as they're getting, no, learning how to be self-regulated is being able to experience dysregulation and find your way through it. And that's why I love that quote, Vanessa, and it's by Mike Lyons, who was an assistant dean of ours. And he said, when a kid is struggling, I think about two things. He says, I think, what would I need if I was in their situation? And what can I put on the table instead of what can I take away?
Well, that's exactly it. Because my temptation was to relitigate why my kid hadn't done the homework, right? That's where we go, because it's like, that's sort of technical, tangible, what the hell kind of situation.
Yeah.
And again, I was on the phone. I was not in person. And I was kind of tired, which leads to either one of two outcomes. One, you're much less regulated and you lose it faster, or you're so tired that you're kind of like able to just sort of be because you're so exhausted. And I happen to have been in the second state of tiredness, thank God.
Yeah.
And you're literally, Doug, you were in my head. This is like a seminal parenting moment for me. And you were in my head and I was thinking, okay, Vanessa, what can you put on the table for this kid? Because it went to, when I said to him, how do we change this? His first reaction was, well, I think I should be banned from the Xbox for the next month. And I think I should have to turn my phone in every day when I get home from school. That was the image, which tells me a lot about how we've handled this situation historically, right? That was his historical data. And I was like, okay, well, we'll get back to that because those aren't bad ideas. But I said, what can I do for you? How can I help you to make it such that it feels more likely that you're going to do the homework, not avoid the homework or not do the homework? And then we sort of like, I didn't get into litigating, even though I know he was full of it about that he'd done it and not handed in. I left that be, even though a year ago I would have relitigated that. I left him be. And we really got to the base of what was underneath his not having done it. And how he, and Cara and I talk about this all the time with audiences. How do we help kids climb their way out of the hole they have dug for themselves? And that's why your colleague's question of what can I put on the table, we use the metaphor of throwing a rope down to the bottom of the well and helping them climb up. And it's like, instead of yanking the rope away so they have no way out, it's giving them a tool, giving them a way to get themselves out of the situation. At
some point, they won't need the rope.
Yeah.
Right. At some point.
But don't they always need the rope in some way
we all
or another?
Need a rope. But I think that's the anxiety that you were describing earlier, Doug, which is like, are they ever going to get there? Are they ever going to get there?
Yeah.
Right. And that's really the question. Okay, Doug. So we're going to do a little quick speed round. This is going to be some tactical and strategic stuff so that people who are listening.
Nice term, Cara. That was really
stuff. It's a medical term. It refers to all of the chaos inside my brain. So I think the goal here is really to distill down. There's obviously so much to how you write about a life filled with these experiences around attachment and dysregulation. And so, but everyone's going to bring their own stories to this. So let's give people just a little bit of quick nuggets. And we're going to start with predictability. Why is predictability so important for kids?
Well, what predictability does is it when we know what's coming, our nervous system is constantly trying to predict what's coming. So if we know what's coming, then our nervous system can be more aware of other things. And I guess what I would say, the caveat, see, it's not easy for me to do a lightning round. So this is a mistake for you guys. That's all I'm saying. But the caveat is we don't all have to say the same thing or have but having a connected and regulated response helps their nervous system quiet. It doesn't have to be, you're going to lose Xbox for X amount of time. It's no, when my parents are upset with me, or when I do something wrong, people are going to be emotionally regulated when they talk to me about it, and the relationship's going to be safe.
That's right. And predictability, I should say, is not just the predictability of the consequence, but the predictability of all of it. Like, there's schedules and rhythms and routines are predictable, and they make people feel like they know what's coming. Rules that set limits that have follow through feel predictable. So predictability really matters. And that is a really helpful answer. Vanessa, you want to go with another speed question?
Yeah. So why don't punishment / incentives work? Because we all use them, and my kid volunteered one. And yet, why don't they work?
Well, they can work in the short run. So that's why I think we continue to use them. The challenge is that when we are incentivized or punished, it focuses on two things: what's in my best interests right now, and what we, in terms of development, I think what we hope is that kids will be thinking about what's in my best interest in the future, and what's in my best interest as part of this community. What's in the community's best interest right now.
But developmentally, how do kids get there? When do they get there?
Well, it's interesting. I think that from very early on, from toddlerhood, kids are aware of other people's needs. So I think that we just want to continue to nurture every opportunity we can for kids to be able to be thinking about and understanding. They're always going to be thinking about what's best for me right now at some level. But what we really want, we don't want to continue to have them focus on that by saying, if you do this now, this is what you're going to get. And so I think taking the pressure off of that is what's important. Not emphasizing it is what's really important.
And help us distinguish between punishment and accountability.
It's interesting. I think we, as a society, we equate the two.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes, I think what happens is with punishments, we actually keep people from taking accountability. Accountability is really I'm taking responsibility for what I've done, and a punishment is I'm gonna do what you tell me I have to do because I've made a mistake. Oftentimes, those things aren't connected. What I talk about is interpersonal accountability. That the work is we all make mistakes, and so can we help kids learn at a very early age that when I make a mistake, it's not about, if I get into an argument with my sister, it's not that I lose my Xbox. It's that I need to make it right with my sister. And then let's move on, right? That this is kind of how life works as an adult. It's really important that we do this in interpersonal interactions with our kids too.
What's your position on forced apology?
Terrible idea. If you want to breed cynicism in taking accountability, that's the way you do it. What I found that has been really helpful, there are a lot of kids who I'd work with who'd be like, I'm not sorry. I'm not going to apologize. I'd be like, that's okay. But would you agree that you'd like that you next time you'll try and do something different? And they're like, absolutely. I shouldn't have done it. And then can you say that? And then they'll say, sure. And so then we'll get them in the room together and they'll say, oh, I shouldn't have done it. I'm so sorry. Right. Like all of a sudden it'll just come out. But I guess the other piece though, is that the person who they're taking accountability with also has to be ready for the relationship to move forward. That you've got to accept their accountability as well, and sometimes that's really hard to do. But this is how we model this. One more thing, real quick, and whenever my kids or a student that I've worked with has been upset, there's almost always something that I can look back on and say, oh, I can see why that would have been upsetting for them. And for kids who struggle with knowing how to do this, whether because they're young or maybe they just haven't developed those skills yet, it's really helpful for me to say, hey, I'm really sorry I called on you. I know that you're anxious about your reading in that reading passage, and I called on you, and I wish I hadn't done that. And in this way, we're modeling how to do that. And then they'll say, I shouldn't have yelled at you anyways, or whatever.
You're modeling empathy. I mean,
yes,
right? It's like,
exactly.
It's really simple. Okay. This speed round is going great. We've got 2 more.
Okay.
Last 2. Let's talk about when one should allow a kid to, I don't want to use the word suffer, but experience the natural consequences of a behavior or a choice. How do we, right? We've all been there where we're at the starting line. We know if we let this go, we know where it's going.
Yeah.
Talk us through that one.
Well, first of all, I love the idea. I think as much as we can, let them experience their own natural consequences. But the key thing is they've got to be natural consequences. So natural consequences are consequences that we don't administer. That's why they're natural. Oftentimes we'll throw a lot of things into the natural consequences. But the goal would be then for them to experience distress, and then to help them learn how to cope with that distress, as opposed to trying to figure out how do I save them from the distress. And I think that's it's kind of walking a fine line, but I think it's an important line to be aware of.
So it's like they forget the homework assignment on the kitchen counter, and instead of dropping the homework assignment off for them, that's a Jess Leahy reference, you let it sit there and you let them take a 0 on the homework and sort of suffer the distress and then have the conversation. But Doug, sometimes the stakes are so high in letting them experience the natural consequences, right? They're college stuff, for example, or, job
physical
stuff,
physical safety.
So are there moments to step in?
I think that that ideally there's a Goldilocksness about this, right? This, you don't want to make things too easy for them, and you don't want them to be completely overwhelmed. But a lot of times you don't assume they're going to be overwhelmed. You watch them begin to get overwhelmed, and then you step in to figure out how can I support them in a way that doesn't undermine their ability to learn from this moment, their ability to learn how to experience distress and know that that's okay, that they'll survive this distress, but also not overwhelming them with distress.
Okay, last question. Can you help us understand why development is on their side in terms of all of this? Is time and brain development really medicinal in many ways for all of this?
I love the question. I learned a lot about this from my good friend Dave Gleason, who's a psychologist, and he wrote a book, At What Cost, about the stress of kids in high achieving schools. The first piece is that the brain is not the prefrontal cortex, which is really driving a lot of the behaviors that make us most anxious and drive us most nuts, is not fully developed into the late 20s. Sometimes they're thinking early 30s now. So if you've got a 7-year-old who's struggling with these things, they're only a quarter of the way through this development, and everybody develops at a different rate. It's not, and yet we think they've got this under their control. At 7 years old, they should be able to do this. But you guys who have multiple kids know that somebody's at 7 years old, one of your kids can do this, and the other one is still a couple years away from doing that. But then what we do is we end up using things to punish and motivate them to do things that they don't have the skills to do. And so it's a little bit like with physical development, we look at it and we can see, they just haven't hit their growth spurt, right? When you've got you've got 2 kids walking in a middle school, and one's 6 foot tall with facial hair, and the other one is clearly still 3 years away from puberty. You guys know more about this than anybody, but we would never say to the kid who's 3 years away from kind of, well, I shouldn't do that because you're right. So anyways, I don't mean to mess up your work, because facial hair is I learned a lot from you about facial hair and puberty and everything else. So let me just, before I put my foot in my mouth too much, but we would never put a kid on a behavior plan to grow facial hair.
Right. It's not their fault. It's not under their control. They are a work in progress. Exactly.
And so the same thing is true in this way. And And so I think that's our work, is to figure out when we talk about stress. And this will be my last thing. I promise. I'll
we don't want you to go, Doug. We just want to sit here with you forever.
So but the interesting thing for me is that as we take a look at kids and development, the challenge that we face is that because kids develop at different rates at different times, when we ask one kid to do something, they're able to do it. Other kids, they just aren't developmentally able to do it yet. And it's this incompatibility between what we're asking kids to do and what their brains, my friend Dave Gleason calls this developmental empathy, which is really understanding what a kid's brain is able to do and making sure that we're asking things that are developmentally appropriate. And for different kids, that's different, but that's where a lot of stress comes in. And one of the things that I think is at the core of this mental health crisis we're experiencing is we're asking kids to do things in 8th and 9th grade that I didn't have to do until I was a junior or senior. And their brains don't develop quicker because we change our curriculum.
Right.
And so we're creating more stress because some kids are able to manage that better than other kids because their brain develops a little quicker. But that's, I think, one of the things that I worry most about is we're asking things of kids' brains that they're just not able to do. And that's creating a lot of stress for kids and then for parents.
Doug, as you can tell, we would spend several more hours with you, but
we feel tethered.
We feel tethered. We do.
I'm in.
So we hope you will come back and visit us. We urge everyone listening to buy Doug's beautiful book, Untethered, or get it from your local library, because I promise you, it has changed me as a parent. And I don't say that often. And if my 14-year-old was sitting right here, he would agree with me that
he'd high five you right now, Doug.
Yeah, he would say thank you. So much gratitude. And what's so amazing about what you do is all these concepts sound very familiar, right? They're things we cover all the time. It's how you talk about them. It's your unique voice and your unique way of helping people understand them that is so powerful. And we're just really grateful that you're putting it into the world so we can tell everyone to read it and use it. And thank you for creating this beautiful gift.
Well, I've loved the time with both of you. Thank you. I could go on, as you can probably tell. I could keep going, but I'm so grateful for how you understood the book I was hoping to write. And so it's very meaningful to me that it's had meaning for both of you, because I just admire your work so much.
Well, obviously you wrote it. I mean, you really did. You keep saying the book I meant to write, and I know what you mean by that, but really you wrote it. It's amazing. Also, I'm raising my hand to do any acting in the audiobook that you might need. I can play act those roles. I can be a kid. It's grab it now, people, while you can, because this book, you can say, I was the first of so many who read this book. That's what this book is going to be.
Thank you both so much.
Thanks, Doug. Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.